Fallacies are mistakes in reasoning. And when certain kinds of mistakes are common, it can be helpful to have names for them so we can more easily identify them. However, in doing so, we run a risk, because arguments can be complex. And if we oversimplify them, we might end up thinking that we've spotted a fallacy where there is none. So in this series of videos, we're going to identify different fallacies, explain what they are, and clear up some common misunderstandings about them. Let's look at the appeal to authority fallacy. This fallacy involves inappropriately relying on an authority to support a claim. And it often involves doing so as a way to ignore or dismiss other kinds of evidence. Here's an example. Suppose you presented someone with data that shows there is no correlation between vaccines and autism. And suppose they responded, "Well, I know that vaccines cause autism because Dr. Smith says so, and she's a doctor. She knows what she's talking about." This would be a fallacy because, although Dr. Smith is a medical expert, her testimony alone should not be used to dismiss the evidence that you are presenting. Furthermore, to appeal to Dr. Smith's testimony is problematic for a second reason. Even though she's a medical expert, the vast majority of medical experts disagree with her here. Her testimony appears to have been cherry-picked to support a controversial claim. One way that people misunderstand this fallacy is that they assume it's always a mistake to use expert testimony as evidence. But that's simply not true. If someone has expertise in an area, it's often quite reasonable to trust what they say. Testimony, especially expert testimony, can be a source of evidence. For example, if your tax accountant says that you can claim something as a deduction on your taxes, you should probably believe him. Given his expertise, and assuming you don't have any evidence against what he says, his testimony counts as a kind of evidence. You're justified in believing him. Now, there will be some examples where it's debatable whether any fallacy has occurred. Consider this supposed example that comes from logicallyfallacious.com. Richard Dawkins, an evolutionary biologist and perhaps the foremost expert in his field, says that evolution is true. Therefore, it's true. Is this a fallacy? It's not immediately clear. Admittedly, the fact that an expert in a field says something is true does not guarantee that it is true. So the conclusion might be a bit overstated. And it would be a fallacy to use this argument as a way to dismiss evidence. If someone was presenting evidence against evolution, you can't prove them wrong by simply appealing to what Richard Dawkins says. However, if someone is the foremost expert on a topic, then their testimony counts for something. And if you're simply using their testimony as a source of evidence, and you're not using it to dismiss another source of evidence, then it's not clear you've committed any fallacy at all. When considering whether the use of expert testimony is a fallacy, here are 4 important questions to keep in mind. First, does the authority have expertise in the relevant area of study? For example, a physicist is an expert on physics, but probably not an expert in medical science. Second, is there disagreement or is there consensus among the experts? Experts aren't perfect. Even the majority of experts can get things wrong. However, when the overwhelming majority of experts agree on a topic, that strengthens the support for it. Conversely, when there's widespread disagreement among experts, that suggests that their evidence might not be conclusive, and in such cases, you have reason to be skeptical about what any particular expert claims. Third, do you have access to the direct evidence? Expert testimony is a kind of indirect evidence. It's someone who has looked at the direct evidence and has reported to you what they've found. This is useful when you don't have access to the direct evidence for yourself. Or perhaps when you do have access to the evidence, but you don't quite understand it. For example, I have access to the direct evidence of the most recent findings in physics, but if I don't understand how to interpret that evidence, it's not very useful to me. In such cases, it's worthwhile for me to trust a physicist to explain to me what the evidence says. Fourth and finally, is the expert testimony being used to dismiss evidence. If someone offers evidence for a claim, then you should directly address that evidence, instead of trying to dismiss it simply because it doesn't fit with what your expert currently says. It's helpful to know about the different kinds of fallacies because they do occur. However, it's also important to be charitable when interpreting someone else's argument. So the next time you think someone might have committed a fallacy, ask yourself this: am I being too quick to judgment here? Is there a way to interpret their argument in a more reasonable way? You just might find that what looks to be a fallacy is not a fallacy after all.